So the biggest difficulty of all, I would argue, is that we've become far too used, in terms of Western societies in particular, to a particular kind of economic development, which, is taking us in quite the wrong direction when it comes to reducing carbon dioxide emissions. We've, since the mid-20th century, had a political debate that basically seeks a competition in democratic politics between the party who's going to maximise economic growth the most. And this is the kind of ding-dong that's been going on, and you've seen it in recent years since the beginning of the recession ended last year, arguments between the main parties as to how we're going to be able to stimulate economic recovery through growth. And this is a part of a pattern that's been going on since the middle of the last century, after the Second World War, where this idea became embedded in the West in particular. That has, since that time, been part of this great acceleration. Economic growth has worked. It's been absolutely fantastic in raising living standards in different parts of the world and increasing our longevity to the point now where we live into our 80s, typically in this part of the world. But the cost of that has been considerable, and if you look at the curves in terms of a whole range of factors, population increase has tripled since the 1950s. Our emissions of greenhouse gases have rocketed. Our demand for natural resources has rocketed. All of these things, part of that great acceleration, I think history might regard this period as, are linked to increasing GDP growth, which is also following a similar curve in terms of global consumption of natural resources, exchange of goods and services, and all the things that go with a thriving economy as measured in the old way. If we continue with that kind of economic development and all of those curves that follow it, then do we believe that it's going to be possible to stabilise at 2 degrees, which in turn implies something like an 80% cut in emissions by mid-century, at the same time as accommodating another 2.2 billion people, most likely? We're at 6.8 billion now, we will be at 9 billion by mid-century. I would think that if one looks at those curves in terms of what GDP has meant in the past, in terms of what it might mean in the future, and then look at the reduction curves, the great deceleration, if you like, that's required by the ecological science, I think this paints a pretty challenging picture in terms of how we can have our cake and eat it. And this, I think, has been the approach of politics in many countries, is to see the climate change challenge as something that can be aligned with economic growth if we do things in a slightly different way. But you can see the challenges bubbling up time and again as governments struggle to square this particular circle. And one of the things that I think was most illuminating in this respect late last year was within weeks of the passage of the Climate Change Act, which is a wonderful piece of legislation that I was campaigning for with Friends of the Earth a couple of years ago. Within weeks of that legislation being enacted here and there being an official target to cut, actually not a target, it's a legal requirement, to cut emissions by 80% by 2050, the government went ahead with the third runway at Heathrow, even though this on its own, that one piece of infrastructure, will place into the atmosphere every year emissions equivalent to the entire country of Kenya. Just that one decision. And yet this was being justified on the grounds that we have to sustain economic growth in the short term. Peter Mandelson went on Newsnight the night before that announcement and said we have to meet our environmental targets, but we have to also sustain economic growth now. So there's a really deep challenge there in terms of how we're going to be able to accommodate the wealth that the economy needs to generate with the climate change targets that are increasingly clearly going above 50, 60, 80% certainly in this part of the world, and in some countries more like 90%. I think part of this is about redefining our economic goals, and there's a great academic literature on this. But one of the examples I think that came across my radar screen this time last year, but longer ago, was the decision to cut the rate of value-added tax. If you remember this, but the Chancellor decided to cut 2.5 pence off of VAT as the recession got underway in October 2008 in order to stimulate high street activity, basically to get us to go shopping. Now, the number that cost the Treasury was £13 billion, more or less, but it was a hit that the tax collectors were willing to take in order that it would hopefully stimulate us to go out and go shopping. An alternative economic choice that could have been made at that point, and I think this is the kind of thinking that's now implied by the climate science, was to say we could invest that 13 billion somewhere else instead. So keep the taxation where it is in terms of people going to the shops, and let's use that revenue to stimulate the economy in a different way. And that 13 billion happens to be exactly the same figure that a group of academics in Oxford came up with in terms of the annual cost of converting this country's Victorian, Edwardian, interwar, post-war housing, which is very inefficient. The annual cost of converting our housing to a minus 80% cut by 2050, if we start investing now. Now, the joined up piece of this in terms of social and economic policy, which I think is compelling in a recession, is that if you diverted revenues in that direction towards modernising our housing, you meet quite a lot of other goals as well, not only climate change ones. You would generate a massive demand for the building trades and the products that they use, and thereby help a sector that was particularly hit by the recession, namely the construction sector. You could also generate a social benefit in ending what in this country I think is quite rightly still described as a scandal, which is the phenomenon of fuel poverty. Last winter, many thousands of people died in the UK because they were cold, hypothermia affecting old people in particular. I remember having a conversation with some of my colleagues from Friends of the Earth Norway a few years ago when we were comparing notes on our climate change campaigning, and we said one of the things we have to do in the UK is to campaign fuel poverty. Fuel what? They said they'd never heard of this concept before because they have such high energy efficiency standards in that part of the world already that people don't get cold, certainly not to the extent that they do here. So there's a social gain to be made there. I think we can look to some of the countries across Europe to see what that could look like in a practical sense. But it does require us taking different economic decisions and having a different set of goals in mind, rather than simply looking to solve our problems through promoting GDP growth, which of course is where the agenda has gone over the last period since the recession began in particular, back on the agenda big time. One of the things that I think is also hugely interesting in this discussion about growth and what it means for us is to compare some of the data coming from different parts of the world in terms of how growth in the economy translates into social welfare. And there's a rich literature which is emerging from different parts of the world telling us that above a certain level of income and wealth generation, that countries begin to show a departure between levels of growth and levels of happiness. And there's a famous graphic that I sometimes use for talks like this, which shows the line of GDP growth since the 1970s in this country, and the line that traces an index of social economic welfare, so basically happiness and well-being and contentment in society. In 1973, these two lines parted company. We reached a certain level of wealth here that no longer relates growth to well-being. And other countries are finding a similar phenomenon as well. And yet we continue to push this as the principal means of how we improve welfare in society, even though it is drastically undermining our ability to meet climate change goals. So I think there's a big economic strand here. An environmental policy can take us so far, but I think we do need to begin to fundamentally question what the economy is for, particularly in Western countries where so much of the impact has historically come from, and from where so much of the impact is expected to come in the decades ahead. This is a big challenge politically, but it's one that I do believe now has to be put onto the agenda in a much more meaningful way, taken from some academic fringes and thrust into the centre of politics.